The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jeff Rumberg. I'm a managing partner with MetricNet, and I will be your host for today's webcast on call center key performance indicators. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for joining our webcast today. To give you a feel for the demographics of our webcast, we've got more than 1,000 attendees from 41 countries in every time zone on the globe on today's webcast. So again, I want to welcome all of you and particularly thank those who've dialed in during the middle of the night your time. You know who you are, in Australia, the Philippines, Singapore, Japan, India, Malaysia, and China. Thanks again for joining us. Now before we get started, I've just got a few administrative announcements to make. During the presentation, all of you will be in listen-only mode. However, if you have any questions during the webcast, you can type them in the dialog box that appears in the lower right corner of your screen. And I'll pause once during the presentation to answer questions. Additionally, I will remain on the webcast at the conclusion of the presentation to answer any final questions that you might have or that I did not get to during the first Q&A break. The presentation usually runs about 90 minutes. So for those of you who have other commitments later in the day, I should be wrapped up by about 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Now before we get started, I have just a quick word about MetricNet. I see that quite a few of our existing clients have joined us on the webcast today. But for those who have not worked with MetricNet before, let me give you just a brief introduction. MetricNet's core business is benchmarking. We perform benchmarks for a variety of industries and functional areas, and we complete some 300 or more benchmarks per year. My role in the company, along with that of Eric Zibkowski, who many of you have met, is to manage the call center, service desk, desktop support, and customer satisfaction benchmarking practices at MetricNet. The work we do for call centers worldwide really spans the gambit, from benchmarking and best practice assessments to consolidation studies and outsourcing analyses. Typically, the call centers we work with are looking to optimize their performance, and we help them achieve those objectives through benchmarking and customer satisfaction studies. Now, for those who are planning to be in Orlando later this month for the annual HDI conference, I would ask you to look us up while you're down there. Schedule some time with us beforehand if you'd like to meet with MetricNet while you're at the conference. And above all, please make a note that MetricNet will be presenting its latest research on industry best practices at the conference, and we invite you to attend those sessions. One final note, and this is particularly important for those who wish to receive a copy of today's presentation. When you exit the webcast, a brief survey will pop up on your screen. Please be aware that only those who complete the survey will receive a copy of the presentation. This survey gives us valuable feedback on the webcast. It contains just 2 questions. It takes less than 10 seconds to complete. So if you do us a favor and answer that survey at the end of the webcast, I'd be very grateful. And in return for that courtesy, I'll send you a copy of the presentation. All right, let's go ahead and get started. If you have any difficulties at all during the webcast, you can reach us in a couple of different ways. You can send us an email at info@metricnet.com. We have people standing by monitoring that email box. Or you can call us at the following number in the United States, 202-321-5760. Again, if you have any difficulties at all during the webcast, you can reach us in one of those 2 ways. Now we've got 4 items on today's agenda, starting with what we call the customer contact imperative. You see, call centers, or contact centers more generally, have become much more strategic within the past 3 to 5 years, and there's some important reasons behind that. And we think it's important to set the stage in this webcast, talking about competitive advantage using key performance indicators. We want to set the stage for that discussion by talking about how the industry has evolved and become more strategic within the past 3 to 5 years. We'll then talk briefly about the research methodology behind these industry best practices and the key performance indicators that drive competitive advantage. This might sound boring, but we won't spend a lot of time on it, and it is important to understand where this data came from, and the fact that everything you see and hear today is based upon empirical observation. There's nothing academic about it, nothing theoretical about it, nothing made up about it. It is simply based upon what we see in the industry day in and day out. Where we're going to spend most of our time today is on our model for industry best practices when it comes to performance measurement, diagnosis, and implementation. We've got a four-part model for KPI best practices that talks about what metrics you look at, how you use those metrics diagnostically. The next step is to develop action plans or prescriptions based upon that diagnosis. And then finally, what steps are justified, what implementation, what action plans are necessary based upon that diagnosis and that prescription. This is where we'll spend most of our time in our best practices model today. And finally, I'm just going to wrap up with a few minutes of pointers on how you can get the most out of today's presentation, not in the long term, but in the near term. What can you do in the next 24 hours, 48 hours, the next week, the next month to see some real performance improvements in your call center? So let's get started with the customer contact imperative. Anyone who's been in the workforce for literally more than a few days or a few weeks knows with certainty that every industry, every company is facing increased competition and increased pressure from a lot of different sources. It might be from industry consolidation. We see that going on in a lot of industries. Airlines, package delivery companies. A whole host of companies or industries, I should say, are consolidating. There's increased regulatory pressure and scrutiny from the likes of Sarbanes-Oxley. That law is now 11 years old. We've got the emergence of virtual businesses, virtual insurance companies, virtual banks, and other types of virtual businesses competing with the more traditional brick-and-mortar businesses. Customers expect one-stop shopping when they do business with you, whether over the phone, through a web application, a mobile application, or through any other source, walking into a brick-and-mortar facility, for example. There's pressure from shareholders who want to see earnings and they want to see the stock go up. But there are also budgetary constraints. Any manager who works in this industry knows that you are constrained budgetarily. You never have enough headcount or dollars or technology. You never have the resources you need to quite do the kind of job that you would like to. At the same time, customers are increasingly demanding, regardless of which industry you're in, and customers do, in fact, have greater choice and leverage. Now, in the midst of all this, there's a mega trend that I think stands out above everything else, and that is the growing importance of customer contact. Historically, customer service was viewed almost as a necessary evil. It wasn't seen as anything that could drive a competitive advantage or anything that could create grow market share, for example, or create customer loyalty. But increasingly, companies are beginning to recognize that this is one of the last unexploited opportunities to build a competitive advantage, to build customer loyalty, to grow market share and dominate an industry through customer contact. For those companies that are savvy enough to recognize this opportunity, they have seen huge improvements in customer satisfaction, customer loyalty, return and repeat business, and in fact, market share. And among other things, we're going to be talking today about how they build this competitive advantage through their contact centers. But let's take a look at some harsh realities. If you look at 8,760 hours in a year, take 365 days, multiply that by 24 hours, you've got nearly 9,000 hours. Yet if you look at the suppliers that you deal with on a regular basis, your bank, your mortgage company, your insurance company, your credit card company, and others, on average, over the course of a year, you have direct contact with them, on average, anywhere from 7 to 22 minutes. Now, that's not a lot of time if you think about it. You expect to be able to call your bank or your mortgage company or your insurance company or your credit card company 24/7, 8,760 hours per year, yet on average, they're only talking to you anywhere from 7 to 22 minutes per year. Look at that leverage. You're expecting to be able to access them anytime, any place, at your convenience, yet you're only spending between 7 and 22 minutes talking to them each year. Now, that's a tremendous window of opportunity. It's a tremendously leveraged window of opportunity for a contact center to create a positive impression, to add value, to create loyalty, to drive repeat business, and to ultimately build a sustainable competitive advantage. But if it's mismanaged, it has the potential to do just the opposite, to destroy value, to anger customers, to destroy loyalty, and to lose market share. And what we want to talk about today is how you take advantage of this window of opportunity, how you turn this leverage not into an enemy, not into something that works against your business, but rather something that works for your business. You see, for many products that are sold these days, customers perceive them to be commodities. It doesn't matter if it's a credit card, a mortgage, an insurance contract, or anything else. Customers increasingly are buying those products based upon the expectation of service that will follow once they have purchased the product itself. So increasingly what we're seeing is that customers are making buying decisions not just based on the product alone, which oftentimes is perceived as a commodity, but rather based upon the expectation of the quality of service that will go along with that product post-sale. So is there an opportunity to build a competitive advantage here to create customer loyalty, to drive repeat business, and to increase market share? Absolutely. But you've got to recognize the opportunity, and you've got to be prepared to exploit it. And that's the real theme of today's best practices training session. Now, because of this, what we've seen is a shift away from the old paradigm of the call center to a new paradigm. Over the last 3 to 5 years, we've seen lots and lots of support organizations, lots and lots of customer service organizations move in this direction. Now, the old paradigm basically viewed the call center as a support function. It was kind of an ancillary activity. Some of our clients even said that customer contact was a necessary evil. Isn't that a horrible thing to say? But in many organizations, that's still how they perceive the customer. They're a necessary evil. We've got to have a contact center. We've got to be able to chat with them. We've got to respond to their emails. We wish we didn't have to, but they're there and we've got to deal with them. Now, the call center was viewed as a supplement to traditional brick and mortar facilities. The goal oftentimes was just playing catch up with customer needs and expectations. They were very reactive, and the goal was mere customer satisfaction. Now, we at MetricNet believe that this goal is a losing proposition. Customer satisfaction by itself does not engender loyalty and repeat business and growing market share. What you need is something more important than that. What you need are enthusiastic customers and loyal customers and customers that want to do business with you. And so what has emerged in the last 3 to 5 years is a very different paradigm where the call center is viewed as a source of value creation. Customer contact is viewed as a company and a product differentiator. As I just mentioned, increasingly we find that customers are making buying decisions based not just on the product that they're buying, but on the expectation of the quality of service that goes along with that product. And increasingly, the call center is a replacement for traditional brick and mortar facilities. It's the only source that customers have contact through your business. The goal is to stay ahead of customer needs and expectations, to be proactive, not reactive, and ultimately what you want are enthusiastic customers, you want loyal customers, you want to be able to differentiate your products and services by virtue of the quality of the support and the service that you offer through this channel. Very, very different paradigm. The old paradigm, very reactive, no value being added. The goal is mere customer satisfaction. The new paradigm says we can add value, we can win customers this way, we can drive loyalty, we can win market share, we can create loyal, enthusiastic customers, and we can differentiate the products and services that we are selling. More than 10 years ago, I had a client that sent this comic to me. The comic reads, "Delight customers, why can't we just satisfy them like we used to?" Well, the short answer, as I've already alluded, is that satisfied customers are not necessarily loyal customers. They're not necessarily customers that want to do business with you. There are no switching costs involved with satisfied customers. Delighted customers, or enthusiastic customers, as we spoke about on the previous page here, are the ones that want to do business with you. They propagate positive word-of-mouth referrals. This is what you need, are loyal, enthusiastic customers. And what we have found is that call centers over time evolve through 3 stages to get to that loyalty stage, to get to that strategic stage. Newer call centers tend to operate very chaotically and reactively. These are the support stage call centers. But at some point, many call centers begin to realize that there's got to be a better way to do things, and they begin to make investments in training and tools and technology in an effort to become more proactive, more preventive, more strategic, in an effort to become a source of competitive advantage. Those that are the most successful enter what we call the strategic stage. Not very many of them get there, but as much as anything else, what we're talking about today is how you make this migration, how you make this transformation as quickly and as successfully as you possibly can. We want you to be a strategic stage call center because these are the call centers that add value. They're a source of competitive advantage. They drive customer loyalty. They have enthusiastic, delighted customers, and they gain market share as a direct result of the quality of service that they deliver and offer through this channel. Sadly, only about 5% of call centers have made it this far, based on the research that we did just recently at the end of 2011. Another 31%, nearly one-third, are in this transitional stage. They know there's a better way to do things. They're trying to break out of the sort of reactive mindset, and they're trying to become more proactive, more preventive, more strategic. A third of them are in this transitional stage, making those heavy investments in training and tools and technology in an effort to become more strategic, but still nearly two-thirds, or 64% of call centers worldwide, operate in this support stage, in this reactive stage. And again, as much as anything else, today's session is all about how you make this transition successfully, quickly, and effectively with the minimum of risk, time, effort, and expense. Let's talk briefly about the research methodology behind all of the information that you're going to hear today, all of the data that you're going to see today. We've been at this for a long time, almost longer than I care to admit. The good news is that during that time, we've benchmarked nearly 2,000 call centers around the globe. These are everything from customer service call centers to technical support call centers to collections call centers to inbound, outbound telemarketing and telesales call centers. You name it, we've seen it. But as a result of that, we've created a global database that contains more than 30 different key performance indicators, and we have also cataloged and created a taxonomy of nearly 80 industry best practices that address everything from call center strategy to human resource management, to performance measurement and management, to processes and procedures, technology, and what we call stakeholder communication. And what we're sharing with you today is one sliver of that best practices model, that is the best practices around performance measurement. And the reason we have a whole session dedicated to this is because we have found that more than anything else, if you achieve excellence when it comes to performance measurement and management, you will have a world-class call center. By contrast, if you're not very good when it comes to performance measurement and management, it's virtually impossible to become a world-class call center. So we're focusing on the very heart of the industry's best practices, and specifically we're looking at what it takes around performance measurement and management to achieve world-class performance in your call center. Now, the data that you're going to see today, as I mentioned, comes from more than 1,900 call centers worldwide from benchmarks that we have done. It includes a lot of different industries, banks and financial services, telecom, healthcare, hospitality, a lot of different industries. But it's important to note the following. The best practices are relatively independent of the industry. In fact, there's at least 80% commonality from industry to industry. So I want you to get past this idea that we work in hospitality, I'm with a hotel, and we want to see best practices just for the hospitality industry. Or I work for a retail bank, I want to see what the best practices are for retail banks. Well, the reality is best practices don't change much from industry to industry. And 80% of what it requires to be world-class is, in fact, embedded in this presentation here this afternoon. Now, we talk a lot about world-class call centers, so it probably makes sense to define that right now. And there's 4 components of this definition. First component is this. The call center will consistently exceed customer expectations regardless of what kind of transaction you're doing. So what this means is that your customer satisfaction levels are high and your call quality is consistently high. Believe it or not, even if you're doing a collections call, you can drive a reasonable level of customer satisfaction if the call is handled properly. So the first part of our definition says you got to be high quality. Okay, that's pretty obvious, I think. But the second part says that you need to contain your costs as well, and you need to drive revenue if, in fact, you're a revenue-producing call center. So we look for business value, and we ask ourselves, is it managed at or above industry average levels? Do you keep your costs below average, and is the revenue generated above average for your benchmarking peer group? So 2 key components, high quality, low cost, high revenue if you're in a collections or a telemarketing, telesales call center. And then 2 more subjective criteria, the first one being that the call center does follow industry best practices. Now, the good news is that these best practices are pretty well defined and documented, and in fact, what we're presenting today are the best practices around performance measurement and management for your call center. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to go out there and search for the best practices or come up with them on your own. You're seeing a chunk of that today as it relates to performance measurement and management. The path is well lit. The best practices are pretty well understood. The key is, are you following those best practices? And so what we want to do today is help you understand what it means to be world-class when it comes to performance measurement and management so that you can follow those best practices. And then the fourth component of our definition, perhaps the most subjective, is that every transaction adds value, meaning that the customer has a positive experience. It has the effect of improving their loyalty, and at the same time, it creates positive brand awareness and switching costs. These are the elements of what we're talking about when we refer to a world-class call center. Four components of the definition: high quality, low cost, high revenue, following industry best practices, and you add value on every single transaction. Now, that brings us to our first polling question of the day. And that polling question is the following. Do you consider your call center to be world-class? Based on the definition I just provided, remember there's four components of that definition. Your high quality, that is customer satisfaction above average. Your low cost, you follow industry best practices, and you add value on every transaction. Based on that definition, do you consider your call center to be world-class? Okay, we like to get good participation on this, and we're up to about 80% now. If you've not voted on our poll, I would ask you to weigh in, yes, no, or if you're not affiliated with a call center, if you're an industry analyst or consultant, whatnot, you don't actually work in a call center, you can vote not applicable. Okay, we're up to almost 90%. I'll give you another few seconds here. We like to get as much participation as we can in these polls because it's interesting when you look at the results. So what I'm going to do now is close that poll down and share the results with you. Here we go. All right. Do you consider your call center to be world-class based on the definition I just provided? 24% said yes. Kudos to you. Another 62% said no, and then 14% not applicable. You're apparently not affiliated with a call center. That's a pretty normal result. It's about a little bit more than 2 to 1 no to yes, meaning that there are about twice as many call centers that do not consider themselves world-class as there are call centers that do consider themselves to be world-class. So I want you to keep these statistics in mind because a little bit later there's going to be another polling question. And it's oftentimes interesting to look at the results of this poll compared to the next poll. I don't want to tell you too much about the next poll because I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but there will be some pretty strong correlations between the next poll, which occurs in about 15, 20 minutes, and the results of this poll. So suffice it to say that only about a quarter of the people that are on this webcast right now consider their call centers to be world-class based on the definition I just provided. Another 62% say that they're not world-class, and then 14% are unaffiliated. Don't have a particular call center. Okay, so we're going to close that down. I'm going to get my pointer here, and we're going to move on in our best practices discussion. Let me show you a slightly different way to think about what it means to be a world-class call center. What I'm showing on page 16 is a two-dimensional chart where we've got cost on the x-axis and quality is measured by customer satisfaction on the y-axis. Now on the x-axis, we've got sort of a reversed scale. As you go to the right, we have higher cost, and as you go to the left, we've got lower cost. Not everybody thinks in those terms. I mean, this is normally how an x-axis would be oriented. A little bit later, I'm going to show you a chart where we've actually got lower cost on the right, higher cost on the left. Now, on the y-axis, we've got quality, once again, as measured by customer satisfaction. Now, the blue dots here represent data points from our benchmarking database, and there's a number of things that we can observe about this. The first is that there appears to be a correlation between cost and quality. Okay, well, that's not a surprise. That's true with almost any product or service. Whether you're buying a house, a car, a service, say a first-class airline seat versus a coach airline seat, or you're delivering something overnight versus in 3 days, generally costs go up as quality goes up. That's not a surprise, okay? That happens with just about anything. But what is more interesting is the fact that the relationship is nonlinear, meaning that as quality increases, cost increases disproportionately. The curve starts to flatten out, which is the diminishing returns effect that you've probably heard of before. That is, as quality increases, cost increases disproportionately, which says that you start to reach diminishing returns. Now, another way of thinking about this is the following. If you are shooting for 100% quality in your call center, that would be 100% customer satisfaction, no abandoned calls, a very low speed of answer, very high first contact resolution rate, and on and on and on and on. It would be cost prohibitive to deliver that level of service. And so you really can't afford perfection. You can't afford zero defects, despite the fact that there was a very popular book written nearly 30 years ago called Quality is Free. Quality is not free, not by any stretch of the imagination. If you've ever bought a first-class airline ticket, you know that for a fact. And that's true when it comes to call centers as well. The higher the quality goes, typically the higher the cost goes. Now, it's important to understand where you are on this curve, because if you're way up here on the upper right, what it says is that you have an opportunity to reduce your costs significantly without hurting the quality very much, because you're way up here on the flat side of the curve. By contrast, if you're way down here in the lower left and your cost is low and your quality is not very good, a lot of times you can improve your quality pretty substantially without increasing your cost very much at all. So it's helpful to understand where you are on that relationship between cost and quality. But the real reason I'm presenting this chart to you is so that you can understand what it means to be world-class. And again, this represents an alternative definition to the one I just gave you, the 4-point definition I just provided. And what this says is that being world-class is not about an absolute level of performance on customer satisfaction or first contact resolution rate or average balance saved if you're in a collections call center or anything like that. It's all about deploying the limited resources you have in the most effective way possible. So every call center manager is limited in terms of headcount and dollars and technology. And the question is, how effectively are you deploying those resources? Are you getting the best possible value from the limited resources you have? If you are, you're going to end up on this upper curve. This is what we call the best-in-class performance curve. This is the curve that you will end up competing on if you use your limited resources in the most effective and efficient way that you possibly can. Now, if you're below this green curve, you're going to end up down here somewhere. Down here on the dash line, we call that the average performance curve. That's where most call centers operate. So being world-class is not about achieving an absolute level of first contact resolution rate or customer satisfaction or call abandonment rate or anything like that. It's about using the limited resources you have so that you can achieve the best possible result with those limited resources. And for some of you, it means that you end up with a very low cost per contact, but also a reasonably low customer satisfaction. For some of you, it means that you end up with a very high cost per contact, but a very high level of customer satisfaction. Now, where you choose to compete on this curve is a strategic decision. It's neither good nor bad. We've seen call centers that operate way up here, spend $150 per call, and they get 98% customer satisfaction. Yep, they're world-class. They operate on this upper curve because they squeeze as much out of their limited resources as they can. We've also seen call centers that are spending $2 and $3 per call, and they manage to achieve a reasonable level of customer satisfaction given the resources that they're spending, and we still consider them to be world-class. So being world-class is not about spending a certain amount of money or achieving a fixed customer satisfaction, service level, first contact resolution rate, or anything like that. It's about deploying the resources you have in the most effective way possible so that you can achieve the best possible result, or the biggest bang for the buck, to use sort of a lay term. Just an alternative definition of what it means to be world-class. Operate on this upper curve. Deploy your resources in the most efficient and effective way possible. Okay, let's switch gears and get right into the real heart of our best practices when it comes to performance measurement and management. Now, we've all heard this expression: if you're not measuring it, you're not managing it. What gets measured gets treasured. There's a lot of variations on this quotation. You've probably heard most, or at least some of them, but there is a lot more to the story. Most call centers collect a lot of data. ACDs collect everything from hold time to wait time to talk time to after-call work time to abandonment rate to you name it. There are statistics out there galore, and most call centers err on the side of too much data and not enough analysis. And therein lies a pretty important problem. So lots and lots of data does not translate into something good, because more often than not, call centers that collect a lot of data don't do much with it. They don't spend any time analyzing it. And if you don't analyze the data, if you don't look at it critically, you're not going to gain much insight on that data, and you're certainly not going to have the courage of your convictions to actually move forward and act on that. But data by itself is useless unless you're willing to act on it, unless it informs intelligent management decisions about how you're going to operate your call center day in and day out. The data, the performance measures, the KPIs, they're not worth much. And so what we want to talk about today is a very different paradigm for how you view your key performance indicators. Historically, call centers have spent a lot of time measuring their performance, a little bit of time analyzing it, even less time developing action plans or prescriptions based upon that, and then very little time actually doing something with those performance measures. But per the arrow I've got here in the middle, the value increases as you move up this pyramid. Measurement by itself is worthless. Analysis by itself is worthless. Even action plans, unless you're willing to act on them, they're worthless. Where you get the value here is in the action step. And so what we've seen with an increasing number of world-class contact centers is that they turn this pyramid upside down. They know that less is more when it comes to performance measurement. So they don't bother tracking 20, 30, 50, or even 10 KPIs. They track a relatively small number of key performance indicators, but they spend a lot of time analyzing that data. They spend even more time developing action plans based upon that and building buy-in for those action plans. And when they act, they do so with the buy-in and the courage and the conviction that only comes from this process of less is more, small number of measures, effectively analyzed, action plans that are developed with buy-in and support from key stakeholders, and then you can move forward and actually see some real and positive and measurable, tangible benefits as a result of your performance measurement. So today we want to emphasize this holistic approach to KPIs, the holistic approach to performance measurement and management that de-emphasizes the measurement piece and emphasizes the action piece, because action is where you get all the benefit from your key performance indicators. That brings us to our central question today, which is this. How do we turn call center key performance indicators into a competitive advantage? How do we make our call center better, faster, and cheaper as a result of the way we handle our key performance indicators? So better, faster, cheaper is not just a cliche. These are, in fact, the three dimensions of competition. Better means higher quality. Faster means quicker resolution and cycle times. Cheaper means lower cost per contact. And those are the only three ways you compete. Either you have a better quality product, you deliver the service more quickly than others, or you deliver a lower cost, or some combination of those three things. So better, faster, cheaper, again, not just a cliche, it actually hits on the three dimensions of competition, meaning quality, cycle time, and cost. We've developed a four-part model, very simple model, but one that is very compelling in the sense that it captures the empirical data that we've seen in this industry over many years. The four-part model involves measuring your performance, using those measures diagnostically, prescribing action plans to improve performance, and then implementing. Remember, all this appeared on our upside-down pyramid. Measure, analysis, prescription, and action. The words are slightly different here. We've got measure, diagnose or analyze, prescribe, develop action plans, and implement, take action. Now, these four elements are arrayed around the central objective of driving customer enthusiasm. Remember, we're not interested in customer satisfaction. That's a losing proposition. Satisfied customers don't tell their friends about us. They don't come back to do business with us willingly. They're not loyal. We don't grow market share through them. They don't do repeat business. What we need are enthusiastic. What we need are delighted customers, because they're the ones that tell their friends about us. They're the ones that are loyal to us. They're the ones that come back to us time and time and time again. And that ultimately is how we build market share and how we create a competitive advantage for the parent company. Now, each of these elements of the model is synergistic and reinforcing. And one implication of that is that you don't have to be great in any one of these areas. If you're just pretty good in measuring your performance, technical term, pretty good at diagnosing your performance, pretty good at developing action plans, and pretty good at moving forward, you're going to have a great call center. So you don't have to be excellent in any one of these areas. But if you're weak in any one of these areas, the whole model falls apart. You could be great at measuring your performance. You could be great at benchmarking and diagnosing your performance. You could be great at developing action plans. But if you're weak in implementation, the whole model falls apart. Same thing with weakness in any other component of this model. So I don't want to lead you to believe that you've got to be extraordinary in each of these four components. That's not the case at all. Just being a little bit above average, pretty good, as I said, is usually good enough in each of these four areas to become a world-class contact center. Now, we're going to begin our discussion by talking about performance measurement. That is, which KPIs do you track and trend? But before I do that, let me talk just a little bit about this model, the fact that it is empirical in nature. It fits the data very, very well. let me share with you a medical analogy that I think will help make this model come alive for you. When you see a doctor, whether it's because you're ill or you're not feeling well or because you want to do your annual physical, whatever it might be, typically what a doctor will start by doing is measuring you, measure your temperature, your blood pressure. They might do some EKG work. They might do some blood chemistry. They'll check your weight. They'll measure you in a variety of different ways. Now, what if you went to a doctor because you're not feeling well, the doctor does all these measurements and says, well, you're really sick, go home and get better. Well, what the doctor has not done is diagnosed what's going on with you. And so when the doctor jumps from measurement to prescription and says, oh, gee, you're sick, go home and get better, it doesn't do you much good because there's no diagnosis involved there. So a good doctor goes beyond pure measurement and diagnoses what those measures mean, looks at the temperature, the EKG work, the blood pressure, looks at all the measurements that have been performed and diagnoses your condition based upon that. That diagnosis in turn leads to a prescription. It might be a prescription for drugs or a change in lifestyle, smoke less, drink less, sleep more, that kind of thing. It might be a prescription for surgery. It could be a lot of different things. But the prescription follows the diagnosis, and then you as the patient have to do something about it. You've got to act on that prescription. You've got to go get the drugs, or you've got to change your lifestyle, or you've got to have the surgery done, whatever it might be. And this is a continuous cycle of measuring the call center performance, diagnosing what that performance means, developing action plans, and then implementing, all in the name of driving customer enthusiasm and building a competitive advantage. So we're going to start by looking at the KPIs, the performance measures that really matter, the ones that count. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, less is more, and you're going to see that principle displayed here in a few slides. But first, let me introduce the two different types of call center metrics that we find. There are operational metrics, which look at your operational efficiency and effectiveness. They're internally focused. You're familiar, chances are, with a lot of these metrics, things like your cost per contact, your customer satisfaction, your speed of answer, agent utilization, all of the inwardly focused metrics that tell you how you're performing as a call center. There's an entirely different set of metrics that we call business effectiveness metrics. They measure the effectiveness of your call center in supporting your company's business mission. Now, they're oftentimes, although not always, focused on your profit and loss, or they're revenue related. These are much more externally focused. Instead of looking internally and saying, how are we running our call center, these look externally and say, how well are we supporting our company's business mission? Typical metrics include things like your sales dollars per call center FTE, your collections dollars per call center FTE. It might look at your call center operating expense as a percentage of revenue generated. Remember, many of these are P&L or revenue related. Not always, but in many cases they are. Two very different set of metrics. Operationally, how well are we doing in terms of business? How well are we supporting this company's business mission? Now let me share with you some of the more common operational metrics. We've organized them into the 6 categories that are shown here of cost and quality, productivity, agent metrics, service level metrics, and call handling metrics. But let me not mislead you here. There are literally hundreds of metrics out there. This is not an all-inclusive list. I think there are 27 metrics on this page. And these are among the most common metrics that we see in this industry. When I walk into a call center, I almost know for sure that they're probably going to be tracking these metrics. But there are literally hundreds and hundreds of additional metrics. These are just the most common, and we've organized them into the 6 categories that are shown here. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you a slightly different way of thinking about these key performance indicators. But before I do that, let's talk a little bit more about the business effectiveness metrics. Now, these metrics are highly dependent upon the types of services you're offering. There is no standard set of measures. They're often related to sales, customer retention, and revenue generation. There's a lot of room for creativity. Now, what we've seen many times is that business effectiveness will sometimes trump operational effectiveness. Let me give you an example here. Let's say you're running a telemarketing, telesales call center, and your operational metrics are horrendous. But if you're driving good revenue, a lot of times we've found that a company's just willing to look the other way. It's a fact, unfortunately, is that business effectiveness will sometimes trump operational effectiveness. So if you're just burning the house down on sales, you're driving huge revenue and market share gains, a lot of times the call center is willing to kind of turn a blind eye towards operational inefficiency. It doesn't always happen, but in many cases it does. And that was the point of this, is that oftentimes business effectiveness will trump operational effectiveness, and this reflects a focus on revenue growth and recovery, and it does allow some sloppiness on the operational side of the call center. It doesn't always happen that way, but it does in some cases. Now, there are also some example, operating expense divided by revenue generated. The numerator, expense, is an operational metric. The denominator, revenue generated, is a business effectiveness metric. So that metric kind of crosses both sides. It gives you a blended look at how efficient you are at your internal operations and how effective you are at driving revenue for your organization. Now let me give you just a few examples of some of the business effectiveness metrics. And here again, the same caveat that applied when I talked about operational metrics is going to apply here, which is that this doesn't even scratch the surface. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of business effectiveness metrics that we have seen for call centers. Let's say you're running a credit card call center. Things like the cross-sell, upsell conversion rate, like a customer calls in and you try and get them into a gold card from the regular card, or you try and sell them an identity protection plan. You're upselling and you're cross-selling other services or a bigger, better card. What about a customer who's behind on their payments? Well, you establish a payment plan for them, and that might be a metric that indicates how effective an agent or a call center is at handling those transactions. If you're in a collections call center, there's a metric called average balance saved. Let's say that we've got a portfolio of $1 million in car loans that are in arrears. They're behind. Customers defaulted on those. The average balance saved represents the percentage of that $1 million outstanding that you collect through your collections call center. There's also a metric called promises kept. That is, if you're an agent and you get a customer to say, okay, I know I owe you a bunch of money. By a week from Friday, I'm going to send you a check for $900, that kind of thing. Well, did they keep that promise? Did you get the check for $900? It's an interesting sounding metric, but it is one that many effective call centers do use. And this gets to the point I made on the prior page, which is that a lot of creativity is found when it comes to these business effectiveness metrics. Let's say that you're in the cable TV business working in a call center. Things like scheduling appointments for the field technicians, and if you're selling products, what's the product count? In other words, do you just sell somebody a basic cable package, or did you also sell them the sports channel and HBO and streaming videos for old episodes of television shows and movies? In other words, is the product count 1.0, meaning you just sell them basic cable, or is the product count 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 because you sell them a bunch of other stuff? And the list goes on. The point is that these metrics tell you a very different story than the operational metrics do. The operational metrics tell you how well you're doing at running your call center. Business effectiveness metrics tell you how good a job you're doing at supporting the company's business mission. Okay, back to this long and ugly list of operational metrics. And by ugly, I don't mean that they're, not useful metrics. I just mean that it's very expensive, and it takes a lot of time, costs a lot of money to track all of this data. And as I've mentioned earlier, data is not where the action is where the action is. Let's go back to that diagram. Performance measurement is relatively unimportant in the greater scheme of things. What we want to do is get to the point where we've got real insight based upon that data, real insight that we can act upon to either reduce our costs or improve the quality of customer satisfaction or drive additional revenue in that call center. That's what we're after. So what I'm going to suggest here is that there's a much shorter list of metrics that you ought to be tracking when it comes to operational performance. And the short list here on page 29, these are the metrics that really matter. Cost per contact and customer satisfaction are what we call the foundation metrics, because everything you do in your call center boils down to one of two things, one of three things actually. Minimizing cost, maximizing the quality of the customer experience, and maximizing the revenue that you're generating if you're in a revenue-generating call center, either a collections call center or a telemarketing, telesales call center. You've got to have these two metrics because they tell you ultimately how well you're doing. We call these the foundation metrics. And if you view your call center through the lens of cost and quality and revenue production, you won't go wrong, because ultimately everything you do boils down to one of those three things. Every decision, whether it's a training decision, a technology decision, a hiring decision, it doesn't matter. It boils down to, does this have the effect of reducing cost or driving higher levels of customer satisfaction or driving higher levels of revenue, or some combination of those three things? If it doesn't do that, then don't do it. It's as simple as that. Everything you do has to have that effect. And if you look at your call center through that lens, it becomes a lot easier to make these types of decisions. Is it going to drive costs down? Is it going to improve the quality of the customer experience? Is it going to drive additional revenue? Now, if I'm doing a benchmark and I find that the cost in a particular contact center are too high or the customer satisfaction is low, I can't go out there and just cut costs unless I understand why the costs are high. And if the customer satisfaction is low, I can't just go out there and improve customer satisfaction unless I know why that's low. So we've got some underlying drivers. Agent utilization is the big driver of cost per contact, and FCR, or sometimes another metric if you're not in an FCR environment, will drive customer satisfaction. So if my costs are too high, typically it's because the agent utilization is not good. If my customer satisfaction is low, typically it's because the FCR, the first contact resolution rate, is not good. Now, why would agent utilization drive cost per contact? Well, these are labor-intensive functions. 2/3 of your cost, about 67% of the total cost in a call center, is related to labor. That includes not just agent salaries and benefits and incentive compensation. It also includes your indirect labor, such as your supervisors, your team leads, your workforce schedulers, your QA, QC people, and your trainers. So collectively, all of the headcount represents about 2/3 of your total cost. So any serious effort to manage and contain cost in a call center has got to look at how effectively you're utilizing your agents. Likewise, FCR is the big driver of customer satisfaction, not for every call center, but for most call centers where FCR matters. This is your big driver of customer satisfaction, and as FCR goes, so too does customer satisfaction. If you want to improve your customer satisfaction, focus on first contact resolution rate. Make sure your agents are trained properly and have the necessary tools, knowledge systems, and whatnot in order to drive high levels of first contact resolution rate, which translate into high levels of customer satisfaction. Now, the fifth metric is one that surprises some people. It's like agent job satisfaction. Why would we care about that? What impact does it have on the three most important things, which are cost, customer satisfaction, and revenue generation? Well, it turns out it has everything to do with those because agent job satisfaction is a secondary driver of those three important metrics: revenue generation, customer satisfaction, and cost per contact. Agent job satisfaction has a ripple effect throughout the call center, and it ultimately is correlated and drives every other metric that is important. So what's not to like about that metric? If you manage agent job satisfaction well and hence manage agent morale well, you will see positive benefits in customer satisfaction, revenue generation, and cost per contact. So agent job satisfaction impacts things like turnover and absenteeism, which drive your costs. It has a direct impact, believe it or not, on customer satisfaction. And because it impacts things like handle time, it will also impact your cost per contact. So even though agent job satisfaction is sort of a secondary driver of our foundation metrics, it's still a critically important driver, and it is something that can be managed proactively. You know, too often when we're working with call centers, we find that they believe agent morale is just something that happens by accident. Either the morale's good or the morale's not so good, and you just have to live with it. That's not the case at all. Turns out that agent job satisfaction is very controllable, and I'm going to show you some data a little bit further in this presentation. It shows you how you manage that agent job satisfaction, why you should manage it, as I've just mentioned, because it has such an important impact on these other key performance indicators. Suffice it to say, it's an important metric to measure because it's an important metric to manage. And then finally, we've got our aggregate metric. We do this with the balanced scorecard, and we're going to be discussing that balanced scorecard momentarily. But before I get to that, let me share with you a slightly different way of viewing these key performance indicators. Back here, we talked about cost metrics and quality metrics and productivity metrics. Here's a slightly different way of looking at those metrics. We've got macro measures. These are measures that tell a story, your cost and your quality metrics. They're good for communicating call center performance because most lay people, they can understand cost per contact. They can understand customer satisfaction and revenue generation. But you can't control these metrics directly. So they're good for reporting out, they're good for telling a story, but they're not good tools for managing your performance. At the other end of the extreme, we have what are called the causal factors. These influence the volume and the mix of work performed by the call center. So let's just say, for example, that your organization does a marketing campaign and they send out 5 million print pieces, or they run some print ads, or they run some television ads, and that drives huge volume to your inbound sales call center. You don't have direct control over those causal factors, but you have to respond to them. So these causal factors could be driven by weather. For example, if you're in a utility, They could be driven by the economic conditions, if you're in a retail bank as an example. There's a lot of external factors that will drive these things. They drive your volume. They drive the nature of the work that comes into the call center, and you just can't do anything about it. They're a function of your business environment. Okay, so I've told you macro measures you can't do much about. Causal factors you can't do much about. Well, what can you do something about? These metrics in the middle, the drivers, your quality, your productivity, your service levels, your agent metrics, and your call handling metrics, these are the underlying drivers of your performance. These are the things that you can control directly, and it's through these metrics that you can influence the macro measures, that you can drive low cost and high customer satisfaction and high revenue generation. So think about the metrics this way. There are metrics that tell a story. There are metrics you just have to live with because the environment deals them to you. And then there are the metrics that you actually control. These are the ones that you want to focus on, or the metrics that you can control. We're going to start by talking about two of the macro measures, cost per contact and customer satisfaction. Now think about it this way. On this x-axis in this two-dimensional chart here on page 32, we've got cost on the x-axis with lower cost on the right, higher cost on the left. Very early in this presentation I told you that I was going to show you a chart with the x-axis sort of inverted. Normally on the right you'd get higher cost. In this case we're showing lower cost on the right, higher cost on the left. And again, this is cost per contact. On the left axis we're showing quality as measured by customer satisfaction. We got lower quality on the bottom, higher quality on the top. Now clearly where you want to be on this chart is in the upper right-hand quadrant. This is where you are both low cost and high quality. This is the holy grail of running a call center, is if you can be low cost and high quality, because that's the ultimate, delivering high quality services at a relatively low cost. Furthermore, where you want to be operating is out here on this outer perimeter. You're either extremely low cost with quality slightly above average. This horizontal line going through the middle here represents the average quality for this group of 100 call centers. The vertical line running down the middle represents the average cost per contact, again for these 100 white diamonds, which represent data points, most recent 100 call center benchmarks that we've done. You want to be operating on this outer perimeter. You might be extremely low cost with quality that's a little bit above average. That's a legitimate and that's a reasonable trade-off, and that gets you world-class performance. Or you might be extremely high quality but also relatively high cost. Your costs are still a little bit below average, but they're higher than they were way down over here. The point is that when you operate on this outer perimeter, this is where you're delivering world-class service. You are in the quadrant where your costs are low and your quality is high. Now, if you're in this lower right quadrant, it says your costs are low. That's great, but your quality is not good. And you need to be moving up over time to improve your quality. If you're in this upper left quadrant, it says that your quality is good, but your costs are high, and you need to be moving to the right over time to reduce your costs. And if you're in the lower left, that's the worst of everything. It says you're high cost, low quality, and you need to be moving up into the right over time in order to reduce your cost and improve the quality of service that you deliver. So when you think about these two macro measures that tell a story of your performance, think of them in this two-dimensional sense. And there is, by the way, a trade-off between these two. You can't have it all. You can't be both the lowest cost and the highest quality call center. It just doesn't work that way. Cost and quality are correlated. There's a cause-effect relationship there, and we showed that a little bit earlier in this presentation, the trade-off between cost and quality. Let's talk about this balanced scorecard. Now, I've jumped around a little bit. We started with the two macro measures. Let's go to this balanced scorecard because I think it's important to introduce this relatively early in our presentation. And I think it's important to understand the concept of the balanced scorecard because it's going to come up again later in this presentation in two slightly different contexts. One being a balanced scorecard for sales effectiveness and one being a balanced scorecard for individual agent performance. Here's how the scorecard works. You identify the most important performance metrics that matter to your call center. In our sample here, we've identified 6 KPIs, cost per contact, that's a foundation metric, customer satisfaction, another foundation metric, agent utilization, which drives your cost, FCR, which drives your customer sat, agent satisfaction, and then average speed of answer. Now, I'm not a big fan of ASA because it doesn't drive customer satisfaction. You'll see some data on that a little bit later. But I've included it because everybody in the world looks at least one service level. They'll look at ASA or percent answered in 30 or 20 or 50 seconds, or they'll look at call abandonment rate just as an example. So I've included it. I've given it a 5% weighting to indicate that it's not terribly important. Now, each of these does receive a weighting. The first two, cost and customer satisfaction, get collectively 50% of the weight because they're the most important. They're the foundation metrics after all. Now, this weighting has to add to 100%, and these are subjective. I'll be the first to admit that. You can pick your own metrics. You can pick your own weights. That's fine. I would just encourage you to put something like this in place. It's very straightforward, relatively simple to do, but it delivers a very powerful message, as you'll see in just a few moments. Next thing I've got are some benchmarking ranges for a particular call center in here. What was the worst cost per contact? It was $35. The best cost per contact was around $6. What was the worst customer satisfaction? It was 60%. The best customer satisfaction, 97%. So you put some benchmarking ranges in these two columns that are the second and the third, or the third and the fourth columns from the left. And then you put your own performance in this column, third column from the right. And the way you calculate your metric score is using this formula down here. You take the worst case and you subtract your actual performance, that's your numerator, and you divide that by the worst case minus the best case, which is the range. So we're taking the difference between worst case and best and your performance in the numerator, and in the denominator we've got the range, which is the worst case minus the best case. And that will give you a number between 0 and 100%. If you're at the worst end of the range, your metric score will be 0. If you're at the best end of the range, your metric score will be 100%. So these metric scores will range between 0 and 100. The next step is to multiply your metric score by your metric weighting to come up with the balanced score. And by the way, all this is kind of documented down here in these boxes, boxes 1 through 6. When you multiply the metric score by the metric weighting, you come up with a number in the right-hand column, which is your balanced score for that metric. And when you add those together, you come up with a single metric called your balanced score. Now, when you look at this and say 54.5%, that's not very good. Last time I did 54.5% on a test, I failed the course. The reality is when we take hundreds of call centers worldwide, we run them through this algorithm, the average score is only about 50%. And it's a nice bell-shaped curve. It's a nice normal distribution. You got tails running off to the right, above 72%. You got tails running off to the left, below 38%. So first quartile is 62% and above. Second quartile is 50 to 62%. Third quartile is 38 to 50%. And the fourth quartile is anything under 38%. Now, the value of this is that in any call center, you got a lot of moving parts. You got cost metrics, quality metrics, productivity metrics, contact handling metrics, agent metrics, service level metrics. And they're oftentimes moving in different directions. In answering the question, are we better off this month than we were last month? Are we better off this quarter than we were last quarter? Answering that question is sometimes difficult. The balanced scorecard neutralizes all that, takes all that ambiguity away, and gives you a single score that you can use to benchmark your performance against other call centers, and that's what you're seeing here on page 35. Remember our score, 54.5% based on these metrics, these weightings, this performance, and these ranges here. We scored 54.5%, 54.5%, that's this orange bar right here. For this peer group, the average score was 50.2%. The high score was 87.5%, this bar on the far left. The low score was 12.6%, this bar on the far right. This call center was above average. You can see that right here. This is the first value, is that it gives you an ability to compare to other call centers on a fair, level playing field, the so-called apples-to-apples comparison. It also gives you the ability to track your performance over time. If you update your scorecard once a month or at least once a quarter and then you track your performance, you can see, as we see here for this one call center in 2011, that they improved their performance pretty dramatically over the course of the year. They just measured their performance using the scorecard each month. They plotted it, and they were able to demonstrate substantial improvements in their performance. Now, if this number is going up over time, that's good. It says that on balance, when we aggregate the cost, the quality, the productivity, the contact handling, the agent, and the service level metrics, if the number's going up, on balance, we're doing better. If the number's going down, just the opposite is true. Finally, when it comes to performance measurement, let's not forget the power of the visual, the power of displays, meaning that in your call center, in the work area of your call center, it's critically important, I believe, to display your performance for everyone to see. Take the most important metrics, the cost, the customer satisfaction, the productivity or agent utilization, the FCR, which drives your customer satisfaction, the agent job satisfaction. Pick a service level like ASA or abandonment rate. I always know when I go in and do a benchmark for a call center, if they've displayed their performance in an obvious location, I know that everybody is bought into the importance of KPIs, the importance of performing well, And that's a call center that, good, bad, or ugly, they're willing to tell everybody how they're performing. By contrast, call centers that don't display their performance in an obvious location oftentimes are the worst performers. They're embarrassed by their performance, and they don't want people to see their performance, so they sweep it under the rug. They don't put it any place obvious. But I can tell you there's a tremendously positive psychological effect for those that work in the call center when you're willing to post your performance front and center, let everybody see it, not just those who work in the call center, but the casual observers who happen to come by, that walk by the call center facility on a daily basis. This matters. It matters a lot. Let's switch our attention now to diagnosis. And we're going to look at the final 3 metrics that we haven't looked at yet. So far, we've talked about the balanced scorecard. We've also looked at our foundation metrics of cost per contact and customer satisfaction. We're now going to use a benchmarking example, case study if you will, to discuss agent utilization, first contact resolution rate, and agent job satisfaction. Now, most of you probably know what benchmarking is. Some of you have actually even done benchmarking. I looked at the attendance list before we started, and we've done benchmarking for, gosh, I would guess at least 50 or 60 of you by this point. But benchmarking, in a nutshell, involves comparing your performance to the performance of a comparable peer group. It's important that the peer group be comparable in scope and scale and complexity and geography. You compare the cost per contact, the customer satisfaction, the agent utilization, the first contact resolution rate, the agent job satisfaction, and the like. The more important piece of benchmarking, though, is not the comparison, but rather the understanding of what drives any differences. So if you identify a gap in your cost per contact versus the peer group, or in your first contact resolution rate versus the peer group, it's important to understand what drives that gap. So the diagnosis is the more important piece of benchmarking, that is understanding how the others achieve a better level of performance. And then you selectively emulate what those better performers are doing. You adopt and adapt what they are doing so that you, in turn, can improve your performance and build a sustainable competitive advantage as a result of benchmarking. You see, given enough time, any call center can improve its performance. Any call center can become world-class. The question is it going to take you years, or are you going to get there in months or weeks? I would submit to you that benchmarking enables you to improve your performance not at an evolutionary pace through trial and error and incremental blood, sweat, and tears, but rather through a revolutionary pace by building upon the industry's proven best practices. As I mentioned very early on in our presentation today, the industry's best practices are pretty well understood now, and key performance indicators are the majority of what it takes to be a world-class call center. By building upon those proven industry best practices, you don't have to improve through trial and error, through blood, sweat, and tears, through incremental improvement. You can improve at a revolutionary pace by building upon those industries' proven best practices. And that brings us to our second polling question for the day. Our second polling question is this: have you benchmarked your call center within the past year? And then we've got a follow-on question to this. Have you benchmarked your call center within the past year? Okay, we've got about an 80% participation. If you can, we'd like you to weigh in on this. We try to get 90+% of our participants to weigh in on these polls. We're almost there now, so if you haven't voted yet, please vote. And I'm going to go ahead and close that poll down and share the results with you. Okay, here's what it says. 27% of you have benchmarked your call center within the past year. Another 57% have not benchmarked within the past year, and then 16% of you did not participate because you're probably unaffiliated with a call center. Now, you may recall in the first poll when I asked if you considered your call center to be world-class, about 27% of you said that you considered your call centers to be world-class. Maybe it was 28%. I forget the exact number. And then 60-some% said that you did not consider your call center to be world-class. Now, isn't it interesting that the yes-no results on benchmarking are almost the same as the yes-no results on do you consider your call center to be world-class? That is not a coincidence. It is, in fact, one of the strongest correlations we've seen in this industry. And one of the strongest cause-effect relationships we've seen in this industry is that call centers that benchmark are almost universally world-class, and call centers that are world-class almost universally benchmark. Now, there's always this chicken or egg question. Are they great because they benchmark, or do they benchmark because they're great? I don't know the answer. In some cases, I believe that call centers are great because they benchmark. In other cases, call centers managed to achieve world-class performance and then began benchmarking. So I think there's some of both in there. But there's a very strong correlation between the results of this poll and the first poll. In fact, I think the 27% who indicate they've benchmarked within the past year almost exactly matches the 27 or 28% in the first poll who said that they were world-class. For those that haven't benchmarked within the past year, 57% roughly matches those who do not consider their call centers to be world-class from the very first poll. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll down, and I'm going to open up our final poll of the webcast and ask you to weigh in on this one. Do you plan to benchmark your call center in the future? Yes, within the next 90 days. Yes, within the next 6 months. Yes, within the next year. No plans to benchmark at this time, or not applicable. If you're not affiliated with a call center, then vote not applicable. Okay, we've got good participation. We're up to about 75%. I'd like you to weigh in on this one. Do you plan to benchmark your call center in the future? Okay, we're almost at 90%. Just want to squeeze a few more votes out of this. Are you planning to benchmark your call center in the future? And if so, when are you planning to benchmark your call center? Okay, let me go ahead and close that poll down and share the results with you. Okay, 22% of you are planning to benchmark within the next 90 days. That's great. 18% of you are planning to benchmark within the next 6 months. Another 16% are planning to benchmark within the next year, and then 30% are not planning to benchmark at this time. The final 15% are unaffiliated, not unaffiliated with a call center, that is. So interesting. Now 30% are not planning to benchmark at this time. Now my guess is that those 30% are the same 27% on the prior poll that have not benchmarked within the past year, and perhaps also roughly corresponding to, in our very first poll, those that consider their call centers to be world-class. I don't know that for sure, but I'm guessing that there's a rough overlap. If you look at the Venn diagram, I think they're roughly coincident. Those not planning to benchmark at this time and those that do consider their call centers to be world-class. Now for the remainder of you, they're planning to benchmark within the next 90 days. If you're doing it in the next 90 days, you got to get going. The next 6 months, the next year, I want to encourage you to stay the course on this decision to benchmark, because as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, there's an almost one-to-one correlation between call centers that are world-class and those call centers that do benchmarking on at least an annual basis. Turns out that benchmarking is relatively straightforward, doesn't take a lot of time, doesn't have to cost a lot of money, and it can cut literally years off your path to world-class performance. Again, it doesn't have to cost a lot of money, doesn't have to take a lot of time to become world-class, and it certainly doesn't cost a lot of money or take a lot of time to benchmark your performance. So for those of you that are planning to do it within the next year, 90 days, 6 months, or a year, I want to encourage you to move forward with that. I think you'll find that it is probably one of the single best things that you can do for your call center. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close that poll down, and I'm going to move on in our best practices discussion and talk a little bit more about benchmarking, because we're going to use a case study in just a moment to talk about some of the remaining key performance indicators that we haven't yet discussed. Now, very early on, we talked about what it means to be a world-class call center, and we used a chart very much like this that had some blue dots here in the middle, and we talked about the diminishing returns associated with high quality. I'm using the same chart, but for a different reason this time. I've still got cost per contact on the x-axis. I've still got customer satisfaction on the y-axis. But the reason I'm using this chart is to illustrate graphically what benchmarking does for an organization. Inasmuch as every call center should be operating on this upward curve where you achieve the best possible result with the limited resources that you have, benchmarking helps you do that. You know, they say there's no free lunch, but I disagree with that. There's a free lunch in this sense. There's inefficiency in any organization. And in your call center, benchmarking can help you eliminate that inefficiency. Benchmarking can help you reduce your cost while simultaneously improving the quality of service that you offer, and that's what benchmarking does. Now, we do have some clients that say, look, I don't care about quality, I just want to cut my costs. They're going just horizontally to the left. Other clients say, look, I really don't care that much about, my primary goal is to improve my quality, so let's leave costs the way they are and just improve quality. They want to move straight up. But the vast majority of call centers we work with are telling us that they want to move the needle on both of these. They want to cut their costs while at the same time improving the quality of their service. And if you're not yet optimized, which is 99 or at least 98% of all call centers that we work with, then benchmarking does help you get to that optimal stage. It does help you cut your costs and simultaneously improve the quality of service that you can deliver. That's the real value of benchmarking. Now on page 44, I've got some real benchmarking data for a technical support call center. It's a particular type of call center. And there's a warning at the top. It says sample data only, and even though the data is real, it's not intended for benchmarking purposes, and here's the reason why. Chances are your call center is going to be different than this one, and you're going to need to benchmark your performance against a different peer group. As I mentioned earlier, selecting the peer group involves identifying call centers with a comparable scope, scale, complexity, and geography. You need comparability in those 3 dimensions in order to get a fair benchmarking comparison. If you just randomly select data, like from this page, you're not going to get a fair apples-to-apples benchmarking comparison. Okay, that said, what I want to do is use this data to help explain the remaining 3 key performance indicators that are on our short list of the ones that really matter. Now, whenever I'm doing a benchmark, the first thing I do is go directly to the foundation metrics. That would be cost per contact and customer satisfaction. So our cost for this technical support call center is $28 per contact, inbound contact. Customer satisfaction, 63%. Now we've got some peer group data here on the right. I think there were roughly 40 call centers or 40 technical support help desks in this benchmark. And we can see that the cost at $28 a contact is above the peer group average, which was around $23 a contact. Okay, that's a concern. Costs are high. Now, sometimes that's justified if we get something in return on the customer satisfaction side, but we don't. At 63%, we're well below the peer group average cost per contact of 79%. So we got big issues here. We're high cost, we're low quality. Remember that 2-dimensional chart? You don't want to be in that lower left quadrant where you are both high cost and low quality, so we need to do something about this. Over the next few slides, I'm going to talk about the relationship of these key performance indicators so that you going forward will have the ability to diagnose your performance in your call center anytime you do a benchmark. Let's start with our foundation metrics. As I mentioned, cost and customer satisfaction ultimately the only 2 things that matter, but they are driven respectively by agent utilization and by first contact resolution rate. How do we know this? Because we've got more data than anybody in the industry. If we look at agent utilization on the x-axis here versus cost per contact on the y-axis here, the blue diamonds represent data points, the red line is a linear regression through that data, you can see that as utilization goes up, cost goes down. Well, that's not a surprise because we know this is a labor-intensive function, and the biggest component of labor are the agents. The slope here is roughly 2 to 1, meaning every 2 percentage point increase in utilization yields a 1 percentage point decrease in cost per contact. The reason it's 2 to 1 is because agents on average represent about 50% of the total cost of a call center. So it would take a 2% reduction in, or 2% increase, I should say, in agent productivity / utilization to get a 1% decrease in cost per contact. No real surprises there. How do we measure agent utilization? We always get this question, so we've included a slide here. Well, we basically look at phone in ear time. And if you have chat, if you operate a chat channel for your call center, then you're going to want to look at chat time as well. But essentially, you look at the number of calls that an agent handles in a month and the number of chat sessions they handle in a month, multiply that by the inbound handle time, and you divide that by the number of days worked in a month times the hours in a day times 60 minutes per hour, and that'll give you a number anywhere from 20% to 70%. The average industry-wide is only about 50%. Most people are surprised by that. But the reason is that we don't back out sick days, holidays, training time, project time, idle time. We don't back that out. We don't create a handicap for anybody. And the reason is that we want everybody in our worldwide database to be measured in exactly the same way. And we routinely have clients that come to us and say, we've got 90% utilization. Well, we know for a fact you don't. You might have 90% occupancy, but you don't have 90% utilization. You might have 50% or 55% utilization, but nobody has 90% utilization, at least the way we measure it. And again, we do this so that we measure everybody worldwide in exactly the same way when it comes to utilization. What about FCR in the relationship to customer satisfaction? Well, here's the data on that. And the relationship is roughly 1 to 1, meaning every 1 percentage point increase in FCR yields an approximate 1 percentage increase in customer satisfaction. So if you're struggling with customer satisfaction, then the lever to pull, that is the area to focus on through training, through technology, through tools, through knowledge management tools as an example, or remote diagnostic tools like GoToAssist or BOMGAR, is to focus on first contact resolution rate, because as you improve that, customer satisfaction will go up. Once again, blue diamonds are data points and the red line is the linear regression through the data. Let's drill down further and look at the big drivers of agent utilization. Well, it's driven in part by scheduling efficiency. If you've ever worked in workforce scheduling, you know that that will drive your productivity and your agent utilization. But what about these service levels? A lot of people are surprised to look at the data on this. If we look at average speed of answer and call abandonment rate, as average speed of answer gets lower and lower, and as call abandonment rate gets lower and lower, costs go up. Well, why would that be? Because to keep the speed of answer down requires an increase in headcount. Let's say we're going from 30 seconds to 15 seconds, and then from 15 seconds down to 5 seconds. The headcount increases geometrically as you get to a lower and lower speed of answer and as you get to a lower and lower call abandonment rate. So you have to staff up to hit a lower speed of answer. You have to staff up to hit a lower abandonment rate. And unfortunately, there are too many call centers in this industry that still believe that low call abandonment rate and low average speed of answer is important to drive customer satisfaction, but it's not. Customers are willing to forgive you an occasional abandoned call. It won't impact your customer satisfaction much, but they're not willing to forgive incompetence as measured by first contact resolution rate. So where you want to focus is on FCR because that drives customer satisfaction. Your service levels don't drive customer satisfaction, but they do drive cost. Now here's the data on customer satisfaction versus these service levels. On page 53, I'm showing ASA as a percent of total handle time versus customer satisfaction. And on page 54, I'm showing call abandonment rate versus customer satisfaction. And what page 54 says is that as long as you keep your abandonment rate under, say, 10%, you're not going to see a negative impact on your customer satisfaction. But if you want to drive your abandonment rate down to 1 or 2%, you're not going to see any improvement in customer satisfaction. That's what the data tells us, but you will see an increase in your cost per contact, as shown here on page 52. But let's look at ASA. And this is not ASA in seconds. It's ASA divided by total handle time. So if I have a 10-minute handle time and a 1-minute ASA, my ASA would be 10% of my total handle time. If I have a 5-minute handle time and a 30-second ASA, that would be, 30 seconds would be 10% of my handle time. Customers are smart enough to judge the ASA in the context of the overall transaction. So when you call 411, you expect a 2 or a 3 or a 4-second speed of answer because you know the transaction's only about 10 or 12 seconds. By contrast, when you call your service desk, oftentimes that transaction is 10, 15, 20 minutes. You've got a speakerphone at work. You just put them on speaker and you keep working. It's okay if the speed of answer is 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 minutes. That's okay. Customers are smart enough to judge ASA in the context of the total handle time, and that's why our x-axis here is ASA divided by total handle time. And if you keep that number below 10% of your handle time, you're fine. Look at this. It's only when you get above 10% of your handle time that CSAT, customer satisfaction, starts to drop off. But why would you go much lower than 10%? You don't gain anything on customer satisfaction, but you do add a bunch of cost. So this suggests that there is an optimal range for your speed of answer and your call abandonment rate. If you go much below that range, you start to increase your cost substantially. If you go much above that range, you start to see a significant drop-off in customer satisfaction. More than anything else, what I want to do is destroy the mythology that says that we need a low abandonment rate and a low speed of answer in order to drive high levels of customer satisfaction. That's not true, not by a long shot. As I mentioned to you, customers are willing to forgive you an occasional abandoned call. Look at this. What they're not willing to forgive you is not being able to resolve on first contact. That's what they really care about. Okay, let's move on. Let's look at how training impacts FCR. Here's new agent training hours on the x-axis versus FCR. Again, blue diamonds are data points. Red line is a linear regression. As we increase training hours, so too does the FCR go up. What about on an annual basis? How much training do our agents get? Well, as the number goes up, so too does FCR. Look at all these blue diamonds on the y-axis. What are those? Well, those are companies that don't provide any additional ongoing training beyond their new agent training. They're all at 0 when it comes to annual agent training hours. How does agent satisfaction impact turnover and customer satisfaction? Remember, I told you very early on that this metric does have a secondary impact on a lot of other KPIs. As we increase the number of annual agent training hours, the FCR goes up. That's a good thing. More training, higher FCR. And we know that higher FCR drives higher customer satisfaction. What about agent satisfaction? Why do we care about that? Well, because as agent satisfaction goes up, turnover goes down. Why do we even care about turnover? Well, first of all, this is a high turnover business. The average turnover last year in North America for call centers was about 40%. It's a high turnover business. The average person only lasts about 2.5 years in a call center, but it's expensive to replace a person. On average, again, in North America, it costs about $10,000 to replace an agent. You got to find them, you got to screen them, you got to recruit them, you've got to train them, and then when they start on the job, they come down a learning curve. They're not 100% productive right away. It's expensive. Again, on average, about $10,000 to replace an agent. That's why turnover is so costly. Now, some turnover is good. You know, when you get people that aren't performing well, when you get people that are hurting the morale of the organization, that kind of turnover when they leave, that's probably a good thing. But in general, when you have a good performer that leaves the organization, that's not good. They're taking institutional knowledge with them. They're taking expertise with them. And by comparison, they're taking low handle time and high first contact resolution rate with them. So turnover is expensive, and you want to do everything you can to minimize that turnover. Here's how agent satisfaction drives customer satisfaction, and in a moment I'll talk about how we drive agent satisfaction to minimize that turnover and maximize that customer satisfaction. As agent satisfaction goes up, so too does customer satisfaction. It's a secondary driver, the big driver being FCR, but agent satisfaction is a secondary driver. Now, let's look at how training impacts agent satisfaction. As the number of veteran training hours increases, this is after the initial training, once you've been on the job for a year or more, how many hours of training do you get each year? As that number goes up, agent satisfaction goes up. That in turn drives turnover down, it drives absenteeism down, and it improves customer satisfaction. Now that might seem like a long digression in our case study on benchmarking, but there's a reason I went through that exercise, and hopefully it'll become clear here in a few minutes. Remember our cost. They were high at $28.17 per contact, well above the peer group average. Remember our customer satisfaction at 63% was well below the peer group average of 79%. Okay, now we know that cost is driven by agent utilization. So we look at agent utilization at 46.7%. It's below the peer group, which is at 53.9%. There's our first smoking gun. Remember, too, that agent utilization was driven by our service levels. So we look at our ASA, which is 18 seconds. We look at our abandonment rate, which is 2.9%. Now, look at the peer group. Their ASA is 45 seconds, and their abandonment rate average is 8.1%. Hey, when I asked the question, why do you have an 18-second ASA and a 2.9% abandonment rate, what I was told is that the CIO told us to keep our ASA under 20 seconds and our abandonment rate under 3%. That was the reason. So that CIO clearly was under the impression that quick speed of answer, low abandonment rate equals happy customer. That CIO was wrong, as we've just shown. Happy customer means high first contact resolution rate, not low ASA, not low abandonment rate. So that was the first problem we discovered. And we essentially said, look, you've got some decent attrition here, 30% per year. This is the annual agent turnover. What you need to do is attrit down to a more reasonable head count. That will cut your cost per contact. And at the same time, your service levels will drift up because you just won't have the head count to pick up the phone in 18 seconds and keep the abandonment rate under 3%. So pretty simple remedy. And the long story is pretty much the same as the short story. Just attrit down to a reasonable head count, and you will see your service levels drift up over time. You'll see your costs go down. Hey, what about customer satisfaction? At 63%, it's quite a bit below the peer group average of 79%. Remember, the big driver of CSAT is FCR. So we go down here and we look at the first contact resolution rate. At 51.3%, it's well below the peer group at 71.2%. Okay, big smoking gun, big red flag. The question is why? And again, we're drilling down into these KPIs to try and find the story behind this company's poor performance when it comes to customer satisfaction and first contact resolution rate. Remember what FCR is driven by. One of the big ones is training. So if we look at new agent training hours, they get 36 hours of new training compared to 79 hours for the peer group, 12 hours annually versus 34 for the peer group. So although training has become sort of motherhood and apple pie, it's become a panacea, and it isn't a panacea, obviously. But effective training that is oriented towards maximizing that FCR, that first contact resolution rate, can be enormously valuable. Once again, the long story here is the same as the short story, which is that they ended up investing more in training with a specific goal and objective of improving their first contact resolution rate. And within about 3.5 months, they'd improved their FCR significantly, and in turn, they saw significant improvements in their customer satisfaction. They ended up within about 6 months going way beyond the peer group on customer satisfaction, way above 79%, and about $1 below the peer group on cost per contact. So they got down to about $22 cost per contact. Their customer satisfaction went up to about 85%. Relatively short period of time, all because they understood how the KPIs impacted and drove each other. And so when we think about key performance indicators, start with the foundation metrics, your cost per contact and your customer satisfaction, but recognize that they are driven by utilization and FCR, respectively. Those are your big levers. Those in turn are driven by service levels and training, as you'll see momentarily. And agent satisfaction, I mentioned earlier that agent satisfaction doesn't just happen. It can be managed proactively. The way you manage it proactively is through coaching, career pathing, and training hours. The more training an agent gets, the higher the satisfaction goes. The more defined and well-documented the career path is, the higher the satisfaction goes. And the more coaching hours they get every month, the higher the satisfaction goes. High satisfaction translates into low absenteeism and low turnover, and it translates into high customer satisfaction. So agent satisfaction is not something you just live with. It's something that can and should be managed. I want to show you just a few additional correlations here before we move on to the final two sections of our best practices model. And by the way, those two sections do go very, very quickly, so I'm mindful of your time here, and I should have us wrapped up within about 8 or 10 minutes. This slide shows the relationship between annual compensation and collections effectiveness. If you're working in a collections call center, one of the primary metrics that is used to judge effectiveness is the average balance saved. I gave you an example earlier. Let's say you've got $1 million of car loans that are in default, and you hand those to an agent and say, collect as much of this as you can. If they collect 600,000 of that, that's 60% ABS. If they collect 400,000 of that, that's 40% ABS. But here's the real insight here, is that if I hire a $30,000 a year agent, their ABS is only about 60%. If I hire a $40,000 a year agent, their ABS is around 70%. Now let's take that hypothetical example I just gave you of $1 million portfolio in defaulted loans, and I give that to a $30,000 a year agent and they collect 600,000 of that. I give it to a $40,000 a year agent and they collect $700,000 of that. That's a pretty good trade-off. I pay the agent an extra $10,000 a year, and in return I get an extra $100,000 in collections. This is one of the paradoxes that we find when it comes to wage rates in this industry. Now the moral of the story is not that everybody should get paid more. The moral of the story is this. Sometimes there is a counterintuitive trend going on whereby when you're willing to pay a little bit more to the agents, you get a more experienced agent, you get a better agent, educated agent, you get a more qualified agent, and they in turn produce better business results. And that's what we're seeing on this chart. Now, the same thing can be shown when we look at annual agent compensation. And by the way, agent compensation varies dramatically depending upon where you are. This is North American data. And if you go and hire an agent, say in Sunnyvale, California, or San Francisco, or New York City, obviously the salary is going to be vastly different than it would be if you were to hire somebody in Biloxi, Mississippi, for example, or in one of the Gulf states or one of the lower cost regions of the country. That's just a fact. It's driven by cost of living in those areas. So there's huge variations geographically in terms of compensation. But the message is still the same, which is that when you're willing to pay up, and it's usually not a substantial amount more, you get a much better business result. Page 66 shows that as you increase the agent compensation, the operating expense as a percentage of revenue goes down. Now, is this because the operating cost goes down or because the revenue goes up? Well, it turns out to be both. Both operating costs went down and revenue went up. So again, the message is the same. There's a paradox here. As compensation increases, oftentimes we see a better business result. Incentive dollars oftentimes pay off. What we're showing here are leads referred to a sales group. These are service agents. And when they have no incentive whatsoever, they don't refer very many leads each month to the salespeople. But when they have an incentive, that is a monetary incentive, oftentimes the number of referrals goes up. Again, blue diamonds are data points and the red line is a linear regression. As you increase the incentive dollars per referral, well, surprise, surprise, you get more referrals. Then if we look at incentive compensation divided by total compensation, it's strongly linked to sales consultant productivity. So this is direct channel sales incentive. So let's say, for example, that a sales rep makes $80,000 a year. At this point, it says that half of that is incentive compensation. So they get $40,000 in base pay and $40,000 in commission, just as an example. Once again, surprise, surprise, as the incentive compensation goes up, the number of unit sales per month also increases. So the whole point of this is to make you aware of some counterintuitive trends in the industry. that relate to compensation, incentive compensation, and the like, oftentimes having the result of producing better business results even though you're paying your agents a little bit more than you would otherwise. I'm going to take a brief pause here, answer some of the questions that have come up so far. And this will be a short pause because I want to get to the remainder of our presentation, but there are a number of questions that are queued up, and I'd like to answer just a few of those questions right now. And then for the questions that I don't get to right now, I will remain on the line at the end of the presentation, and I'll answer any remaining questions that you typed in. Okay. Question from Bill. I didn't see technical support industries in your list of 1,900 call centers. Do you not look at those? Short answer is yes, absolutely we do. That's one of our strongest industries. The 1,900 call centers refer to non-technical support call centers. We've looked at roughly the same number of technical support call centers, otherwise known as service desks. We also do a lot of work for field service and desktop support organizations. Okay. Also a question from Bill. When benchmarking offshore call centers, do you compare to all peers or similar offshore call centers? You have to compare to similar offshore call centers, otherwise the cost data is not comparable. For the reasons that I mentioned, which is that wage rates vary dramatically depending upon where you are, and you can't compare a U.S. call center, for example, to a call center in India or the Philippines or Mexico or Costa Rica. The wage rates are too different, and hence the costs are too different. However, when you look at the non-cost related metrics, like your FCR, your customer satisfaction, and so on, you can compare from onshore to offshore. You just can't compare cost onshore to offshore. Okay. Question from Kristen. Where do I find peer group data to use for benchmarking? I would suggest that you go to the MetricNet website, click on the shopping button on the navigation bar, and you'll find all the data that you need there for your benchmark, your call center benchmark, your service desk benchmark. That's probably the easiest place to find it. Okay, question from Nate. Will the recording be available, the presentation? The answer is yes. We'll send you a link to the recording. Question from Randy. What is your opinion of tracking wrap-up codes for all calls? I'm not sure what a wrap-up code is. I would assume that you're talking about a call type, CTI or CLIN, as they sometimes call it, category type incident in the technical support world, or CLIN is just a different designation for the call type. So I assume that that's what you're talking about. It really depends, Randy, on the duration of the call. If we're talking about calls with a handle time of 10 minutes or more, I do think that having wrap-up codes on each of them is appropriate. But if we're talking about a handle time of just a few minutes, maybe 2, 3, 4 minutes, I think that the amount of time required to insert a wrap-up code into the trouble ticket is a significant amount of the overall handle time, and it probably isn't worth it, except for certain call types. So I've got mixed feelings about this. For the longer handle times, I do think it's important to show those codes. For the shorter handle times, I'm not sure it's worth it. Okay, from Purnell, the AHT in relationship to ASA mentioned earlier, is that from the customer perspective, given that most ACD systems don't include ASA in the average handle time, the AHT and the ASA? Average handle time in relationship to the average speed of answer from the customer perspective, given that most ACD systems don't include. Yeah, you're right. The average speed of answer is not part of the handle time. The data we have shows that even a long speed of answer does not have an impact on customer satisfaction as long as they get their call resolved on first contact. However, if the call is not resolved on first contact, a long speed of answer will be an exacerbating factor. It will make the customer satisfaction even lower than it otherwise would be. So the ASA works against you if you don't resolve the contact on the first contact. The ASA does not hurt you if you resolve on first contact. Okay, question from Vladimir. Hi there. Is there an age demographic analysis versus tenure? We don't have specific data on the tenure. That is the amount of time that an agent spends on the service desk versus their age. We've never actually tracked that, in part because you can't ask the question about age when you're doing a benchmark. It's considered discriminatory. And I've not seen, just based on my observation, who's been around for a long time, who hasn't been around for a long time, I have not seen any correlation between tenure and age. So the short answer is we haven't tracked that metric because it's illegal to ask a person their age when you're in an environment like this. But just anecdotally, I can tell you, I don't think there's much of a correlation. Okay, there are additional questions, and I will get to those, but I want to wrap up our presentation fairly quickly here and then get to any Any remaining questions that you have, please type those into the dialog box, and I will get to those questions at the conclusion of our presentation. Let's talk about the third component of our model, which is the action planning. On pages 71 through 74, what I've got are a series of cheat sheets, and each one is constructed as follows. In the upper right-hand corner, I've shown a list of key performance indicators, those that we believe to be among the most important, like cost per call, customer satisfaction, agent utilization, FCR, and the like. Along the left-hand axis, I've listed some best practices. The particular page we're looking at has to do with human resources. The left-hand column is kind of a shorthand for the best practice. The middle column gives a little bit more definition to the best practice. I don't want you to believe, or I don't want to lead you to believe that this is an all-inclusive list of human resource best practices. They're just some of the more important best practices. Now, I've organized these 4 slides in a particular order. We start with performance measurement, we go to human resources, we go to call handling processes, and we go to technology. Now, you've all heard the paradigm people, process, technology. That is, you put people ahead of process, and you put process ahead of technology. That's the way it should be. But I put something even ahead of people, and that something is performance measurement, because no matter how well you manage your people, your processes, and your technology, unless you've got good performance measurement and management, you will not have a successful call center. So the order of these 4 slides is this way for a particular reason. Now let me tell you how you interpret these slides. Page 72 has to do with human resources. Once again, we've got the affected KPIs in the upper right-hand corner. We've got the best practices listed down the 2 left-hand columns. And if you go to the intersection of any key performance indicator, like first call resolution rate, and any best practice like training, you will see that the cell is either white, light blue, or dark blue. Now, a dark blue cell indicates a strong cause-effect relationship between the key performance indicator and the best practice. So if I do a benchmark and I find that my first contact resolution rate is not very good, I know that training is one of the factors. That is, if I focus on training, I can improve my FCR. Well, that's not rocket science. I think most people could figure that out. Some of these relationships are not quite as intuitive. For example, handle time. Okay, let's look at first contact resolution rate. Okay, there's a dark blue cell between FCR and performance standards. It turns out that just having a performance standard for FCR goes a long ways towards improving an FCR. I've seen first contact resolution rate improve by 5 to 10 percentage points almost overnight just by putting an FCR goal in place. This is one of those non-obvious correlations where a performance standard by itself can actually significantly drive the performance in a particular area. A light blue cell, again, represents a weak cause-effect relationship, so call quality is a weak function of recruitment. And a white cell indicates little or no cause-effect relationship between the affected KPI and the industry best practice. Now, I've lumped the business effectiveness metrics together in the upper right-hand corner, and the reason for that is that the business effectiveness metrics tend to move together. That is, they tend to move in the same direction at the same rate, whereas the operational effectiveness metrics oftentimes move in different directions. So I felt comfortable lumping the business effectiveness metrics together and then separating out the operational metrics. But these charts, these 4 charts here, give you some insight into which KPIs are driven by which success factors, which best practices. And if you do a benchmark and identify a performance gap in any particular area, any of these KPIs, what you need to do is look at the underlying drivers of those KPIs, and you can pull these levers in human resources, in performance measurement and management, in call handling processes, and in technology in order to close those gaps. Okay, one other thing, the scorecard, and I mentioned this earlier, the scorecard that we introduced can be used in a lot of different ways. We showed you earlier an operational performance scorecard. On this page, I'm showing you a sales effectiveness scorecard. So the same methodology can be used to look at your overall sales effectiveness and measure your overall sales effectiveness. There's our 31.2% performance. Our average is 51.5% for this benchmarking peer group. And we can create a build for the key performance indicators and how they affect each other, just like we did for the operational KPIs. Sales rep satisfaction is driven by career path, training hours, incentive compensation, and coaching. That in turn drives the effectiveness of the sales reps as measured by sales dollars per rep per month, the policy sold per rep per month, the average size of sale, the percentage of contact yielding a sale, and the number of units per sale. All of those feed into this overall measure that we call sales effectiveness. So this scorecard that I introduced earlier on the operational side can be just as effective in a sales call center. Okay, let's turn to our final component of the model, which is implementation. We've talked about performance measurement, less is more. We've talked about benchmarking. We've talked about developing action plans based upon the results of the benchmark, and I showed you 4 sort of cheat sheets, if you will, that will help you develop those action plans to improve your performance. Now what we want to talk about is where the rubber hits the road, implementation. Page 84 is a very simplified action plan, but a real action plan that a client of ours implemented a year or so ago. They did not perform well on their initial benchmark. They knew they had big problems, and they undertook an 8-step process, starting with documenting their call handling standards, creating a balanced scorecard. They started surveying their customers, which they hadn't done before their benchmark. They created an agent career path and publicized that for their agents. They started doing root cause analysis to figure out how to improve first contact resolution rate. They put a set of agent performance standards in place. They rewrote their IVR menus, and they implemented call monitoring through a silent monitoring program. I think Witness was the tool that they used. Now look at this. They started this in early March, and they were done by the end of the year. It took them 10 months, but they did achieve world-class performance in that period of time. It wasn't terribly time-consuming. It certainly wasn't terribly costly for them. But when you get to this stage in the process, assuming that you've followed our prescription for measurement, diagnosis using benchmarking, action planning, you have no choice but to move forward with it. Page 85 just shows you one way that you can prioritize your action plan. We've got 3 dimensions shown here. The x-axis shows the impact each action item is expected to have, higher on the left, lower on the, higher on the right, lower on the left. The relative cost of each action item, higher is on the top, lower is on the bottom. And then the urgency based upon the color. This is just a way of helping you prioritize your action plan so that you can focus on the big bang for the buck items. Item number 1, high impact, low cost. That's probably where you're going to want to start, especially since there's red there. It's urgent. This is something that needs to be taken care of right away. So a diagram like this, even though it's subjective and qualitative in nature, can really help you prioritize your action plan. Now let's not forget that one of the primary purposes of key performance indicators is to establish performance goals. But just as important as establishing performance goals is the knowledge that call centers are not living, breathing entities, and if you put a goal in place for the call center doesn't know that it's got a goal. What you have to do is drive the goal down to the individual agents. So if you want to achieve something at a call center level, you've got to drive it down to the agent level. And in a moment, I'm going to share a scorecard with you for the agents. Now, these are just sample performance goals, and in many cases, you'll see that the goal for the agent was higher than the goal for the call center because there's usually an expectation that not every agent will achieve the goals. You still want the call center to achieve the goals. The 2 key points here. 1, use KPIs to establish performance goals. 2, you've got to drive the goals down to the individual agents because without that accountability at the individual level, in my opinion, you don't have much chance of achieving those goals at the call center level. Now, the example on this page, same scorecard, same mechanics, only this time applied to the individual agents that work in the call center. Even subjective things like teamwork and initiative and mentoring, you can put those on a scale of 1 to 5 and quantify them, and you can run a scorecard that looks at both quantitative or objective measures like FCR and customer satisfaction, as well as subjective measures like teamwork and initiative and mentoring. But the value of this is that it objectifies and quantifies the feedback process for the individual agents. So when you sit down and deliver feedback to an agent, you're not just waving your hands and saying, hey, you did a great job, keep it up. You're actually quantifying their performance and showing them how they performed relative to others in the call center and what they can do to improve their performance. On page 88, not everybody is comfortable with this, but an increasing number of call centers that we work with will actually post the agent performance in a public location so that everybody can see it. Now keep in mind, we're not naming the agents by name. We're not saying this is Mary and this is John and this is Susan and this is Joe. We're actually designating them by number. Now here's what it does, is that if you're agent number 27, you see that for the month of September, you ranked number 17. Your score was 43.7 using the scorecard shown on the prior page. But you've come a long ways. Way back in April, you were at 17.2%. So you've improved over time, but you're still not doing terribly well. Now, the value of this is the following. You're not trying to embarrass anybody. You're not trying to make anybody feel bad. You're trying to motivate people. And for those that consistently perform in the bottom tier, they're probably going to self-select out, or at the very least, they're going to know that they're not performing very well. And if they're not, they have an opportunity to better their performance and work their way up this chart. Again, not everybody is that comfortable with this mechanism, but an increasing number of call centers we work with are adopting this so that they can give each agent feedback, quantitative feedback on a monthly basis that shows them where they need to focus, and it also shows them how they stack up relative to other agents in the call center. So what does all this mean? Okay, today I've introduced a four-part model that involves measuring your performance, using those metrics diagnostically, developing action plans, and then acting on those action plans. To recap, the measurement component of our model stresses the idea that less is more. There are two types of metrics. There are operational metrics and business effectiveness metrics, and you should use them both. And you should also include a balanced scorecard so that you can come up with a single overall measure of your call center performance. Once you've identified the metrics that you're going to track on an ongoing basis, you need to benchmark your performance at least once a year. As I mentioned, there's a one-to-one correlation between call centers that are world-class and those that do benchmarking. But select an appropriate peer group and use the KPIs that were defined in this webcast. You can identify performance gaps and then use the benchmark to diagnose the underlying drivers of the performance gap. It's not good enough to just know there's a gap. You've got to understand why that gap exists. Now, once you understand why the gap exists, you can develop a simple action plan based on the best practices and the gap analysis. You don't have to hit a home run. Look for the low-hanging fruit. That is the easy stuff. Do what's realistic in the near term. But subject it to this acid test. Every action you implement should have the effect of either cutting your costs, improving customer satisfaction, or enhancing revenue. If it doesn't do one of those three things, or some combination of those three things, it just isn't worth doing. As simple as that. Cut it from your list. Focus on those things that have one or more of the three effects: reducing costs, improving customer satisfaction, or enhancing your revenue. And then put your plan into action. Implement your action plan, build buy-in from the start, assign ownership and accountability. A lot of different ways to do that. I just showed you one through the agent scorecard. Establish goals for your performance. Monitor your progress over time. And you should expect positive measurable results. And I'm not talking about in a one-year time frame or even a 3-month time frame. There are things that you've learned here today that you can put into place almost immediately that will yield almost immediate positive results. So now's your chance to excel. Performance measurement in the call center should be viewed holistically. It goes well beyond tracking and trending to produce actionable insight. Now, the near-term goal is improved performance. The ultimate goal for any organization, any call center that is serious about becoming world-class is, in fact, world-class performance, and we defined what that is earlier. Effective performance measurement and management is the key to becoming world-class. As I mentioned, there's a one-to-one correspondence. And the key to getting there is to take action. The old Nike ad says, just do it. Just take these steps, benchmark your performance, develop an action plan, and move forward with it. So in closing, there are a few things that you can do in the near term to get started. The first, once again, visit us if you're down in Orlando next month, or set up an appointment with us. We'd like to meet you, and we'd like you to attend our sessions. We're presenting our latest research at the HDI conference in Orlando. You can also register for our future webcasts. Go to our website, MetricNet.com. And you can register. Next month, we're going to be talking about KPIs for desktop support. And then in June, we're going to be looking at KPIs for the service desk. Then we go to call center best practices in July and so on. We'd like you to register for those if you can. Over the next 24 hours, everybody on this webcast will receive an email from MetricNet inviting you to participate in a brief consultation session. These are 30-minute sessions with a MetricNet call center expert. They're free of charge. They're only for webcast attendees. And again, you'll be receiving an invitation from us. If you'd like to reach out to us to schedule that, you can call us at this number in the United States, 703-992-8160, or you can email us at info@metricnet.com. I would also encourage you to download our best practice white papers. If you go to our website, you'll see that there are a host of white papers there related to productivity, related to benchmarking, related to key performance indicators, and a variety of other best practices. And finally, for those that are serious about becoming world-class and want to get there quickly, MetricNet's call center benchmark is probably the quickest and easiest way to get there. This benchmark is built on our worldwide database of call center process and performance indicators, and it's the most comprehensive benchmark in the industry. It includes benchmarks of more than 25 key performance indicators. It includes a balanced scorecard, a process maturity assessment, and a roadmap to achieve world-class performance that is very specific and unique to your call center. Now, a call center benchmark is just one of the ways in which we can assist you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webcast, we can also do benchmarking for service desks, desktop support, and for customer satisfaction. Now, for those who have time to stay on for a few minutes, I'll be answering any remaining questions that you typed into the dialog box during the webcast. For those who have to exit the webcast at this time, I just want to thank you for attending the session. I do hope you found it to be insightful and informative. Please remember to complete the brief survey that pops up when you exit the webcast. This is a requirement if you wish to receive a copy of today's presentation. So thank you once again. Let me get to some questions now. Okay. All right. Okay, question from Bill. Do you look at email stats or only calls? The question is, to effectively evaluate a call center, you've got to look at all the contact channels. You've got to look at the voice, the voicemail, the chat, the web self-service, the IVR self-service, and the likes. So you can look at email as well. Now, a lot of the metrics that apply to live voice calls also apply to email calls. For example, the handle time, the customer satisfaction. There are a number of metrics that apply equally well to emails as they do to live voice. However, when it comes to first contact resolution rate and the service levels like call abandonment rate, speed of answer, there's not a direct application. So what appears to be happening in the industry is that emails are considered to be resolved on first contact if they're resolved within 1 hour. That's kind of the de facto standard that's emerging in the industry right now. That may or may not be appropriate for the types of calls that you're supporting or the types of emails that you're supporting, but FCR increasingly, or the consensus in the industry is that if an email is resolved within an hour, it's considered first contact resolution rate. The last thing you want to do is treat your email as a separate queue from your live voice calls, because it's important to balance your live voice calls with your email calls. It allows you to even out the workload somewhat. And if all you're doing is checking your emails once every few hours, or worse, twice a day or once a day, you're going to discourage people from using that channel. It's an important channel to have because it does balance out the live voice calls. It allows you to do workforce scheduling a little bit more effectively. So the worst thing you can do is treat the live voice channel with priority over the email channel. Really, you ought to be treating those as coincident workflows. That is, treating them with the same sense of urgency. So there are a few quirks when it comes to email statistics, email benchmarking that need to be taken into account, such as the first contact resolution rate. But the most important principle I'd leave you with when it comes to email is that don't treat that as a separate queue from live voice, because if you're treating it as a secondary channel, customers will figure it out and they'll start going to live voice instead of using email, and you want them to do just the opposite because it helps you with your call handling statistics. Okay. Question from David. He says, how do I get a PDF? The answer is fill out the questionnaire that pops up when you leave the webcast, and we'll send you a copy of the PDF. Question from Purnell. What is your suggestion, if any, as far as implementing Lean Sigma in contact centers in relation to driving KPIs? My suggestion is stay away from Lean Sigma. It's way too complicated. Doesn't do anything. It doesn't have to be that complicated, in my opinion. I mean, we've worked with call centers that are doing all this black belt and Lean Sigma type stuff. ITIL foundations and everything else, and it really doesn't do much for them. It just complicates it. Becoming world-class is pretty straightforward. 80% of what you need to become world-class you just learned in the last hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. So this whole idea of Lean Sigma, I just don't buy into it. It might be good on a production line, an assembly line, where you're creating hundreds of thousands of the same thing over and over and over again. Lean Sigma might apply. But when you're talking about an individual call center environment, although the principles might be useful, actually putting it into practice in a call center, in my opinion, is very problematic. You can achieve a far better result in far less time applying some of the principles you've seen here today than going the Lean Six Sigma route. So on the one hand, yeah, it's good to know that and know all about it, but Lean Six Sigma isn't going to get you where you need to go, certainly not in any reasonable period of time. Question from Randy. For technical service desks in the ITIL framework, what are the best practices for increasing the percentage of problem matching to apply known workarounds or solutions in a knowledge management solution base? What are the best practices for increasing the percentage of problem matching? Apply known workarounds. First of all, workarounds shouldn't be considered a standard solution. Clearly, they exist from time to time, and if you can't get a customer up and going, you want to give them a workaround, but it worries me a little bit that you used workaround in your question because it suggests that that's part of your normal protocol. Workarounds can and should be used from time to time, particularly if it's going to take a while to get a network up and running or there's some other outage that affects a large number of users. You want to give them whatever workaround there is, but ideally the workaround is not the best solution. What you need is a real solution, and you need it as soon as possible. Okay, how do you apply the problem to the knowledge management system? Well, for one thing, you've got to have a decent knowledge base where the solutions are reasonably searchable. We do a survey every year of technical support organizations, and 90% or more of technical support organizations now claim to have a knowledge management system. But the second question, which is, do you have any knowledge in the knowledge base? Only about 30% of them have any knowledge in the knowledge base, which is another way of saying that buying a knowledge management system is cheap. Populating it and maintaining it is not cheap. It's expensive. So in terms of, how do you match a problem to a solution? Nobody's going to do it for you. You have to have a well-managed knowledge base. That is where you purge old solutions and update existing solutions. You've got to keep it fresh, and you've got to keep it populated, and that takes a lot of time. It costs a lot of money, and it's scale sensitive. If you have a 10-person call center, it isn't worth it. If you have a 100-person call center, it might be worth it. You've got to do the business case analysis. But the second thing is that your agents have to be well-trained, because if you're looking for the automated solution that says, oh, here's the problem, click the box, here's the solution, that's never going to happen. You need a well-designed, well-maintained, well-managed knowledge base, and you need well-trained agents who know how to use that knowledge base and know where to find the solutions. There's no substitute for those two things. Okay, another question from Randy. How do we measure chat-based service desks, which has become a hot trend? How do we compare chat to voice? Well, most of the metrics are comparable. Chat customer satisfaction versus voice customer satisfaction. Those are comparable. Chat first contact resolution rate versus voice first contact resolution rate. Those are comparable. Average speed of answer versus average speed of response in chat. Those are comparable. So I'm not sure what your question is. You're acting like they're so vastly different you can't compare them. But the point is that they're very comparable. Chat is just another live vehicle. It's lacking the voice, but most, if not all, of the metrics that apply to voice contacts apply to chat contacts equally well. Question from Shane. I'm unable to download white papers from the site due to a server error. Is there a way to receive them via email? Not sure what the problem is. Other people were downloading white papers earlier today, so you might want to try back, or you might want to reboot your computer and then try back. If there is a persistent problem, we'll of course fix it, but people earlier today were downloading those white papers without any problem, so I suspect, Shane, that the problem's on your end. Okay, other questions. I think I've addressed most, if not all, of the questions that were typed in, but I want to give you another few seconds here in case you have a different question. So, okay, no new questions as far as I can tell. Okay, here we go from Robert. The prompt is not coming up with questions to allow me to get a copy of the presentation. Okay, not sure what the problem is, Robert. Normally when you exit, see, you're still on the webcast, which is why you're able to reach me. When you exit the webcast, a prompt will come up and will allow you to answer the questions, the survey, and then we'll send you the PDF. If for any reason that prompt doesn't come up, just let us know. Just email us and we'll send you the PDF. Okay, from Kristen. As a third-party support contact center, many clients require us to write SLAs around ASA and abandonment rate. What do you recommend as a solution for writing SLAs around KPIs you mentioned, meaning more to service like FCR and CPC, cost per call? We're at risk for ridiculous SLAs that I can't staff to support, and it doesn't seem that the client is benefiting from them either. Okay, it sounds like your sales force needs a bit of education. Client might need a bit of education as well. This is pretty common. Salespeople think ASA and abandonment rate are the be-all and end-all. They think those are important service levels. And what you're describing is a very common phenomenon in the outsourcer or third-party BPO world, which is that too many contracts are based upon service levels that are obsolete. So ASA and abandonment rate don't make much difference, but FCR makes a big difference. And first level, FLR, makes a big difference as well. So I believe the problem is twofold. One, you've got overly zealous salespeople that are willing to sell anything at any cost, and they understand ASA, but they don't understand FCR and FLR. And the second is that your client may not understand it. Your client needs to be educated as well. Typically, when clients understand the importance of FCR, cost per contact, and first level resolution rate over the outdated metrics like ASA and abandonment rate, they're more than willing to switch over to those service levels. But the sales department, whoever it is that's selling this stuff for your company, needs to be educated on that as well. That's the two-part solution. Educate the sales force, educate the customer, enter into future contracts by de-emphasizing ASA and call abandonment rate and emphasizing things like FCR and first level resolution rate. Cost per contact typically doesn't show up in a service level because that's, quote, secret information that the outsourcer isn't going to share with you. But when you make your decision, of course, there's a price that you're making that decision based upon, and that price has to be weighed against the FCR and the customer satisfaction that the vendor proposes to meet. So a service level, most people don't think of customer satisfaction as a service level. I think it's the ultimate service level. The vendor should be willing to put their neck on the line and say, we're willing to hit, say, an 85% FCR and a 90% customer satisfaction level. And if we fall short of that, we're willing to give back some of your money. If we exceed that, there might be a little bit of a financial incentive. So the real service levels are not cost per contact, but rather FCR and customer satisfaction and first level resolution rate. Okay, let's see. From Jassim, what is the average percentage of first call resolution in the industry best practices? Can't answer that question because it really depends upon what you're trying to do. Depends upon your industry, depends upon the type of calls. In some environments, anything short of a 98% FCR is a failure. In other environments, being more than 50% FCR is a pretty big success. So I can't answer the question definitively unless I understand what types of support you're providing and unless I understand the types of calls and chats that you're getting. Question from Ryan. Last session I had, there was a video. Is there a format available to download instead of GoToMeeting, blah, blah, blah. Will this video be available? Ryan, we'll send you a link to the recording of this webcast. Hopefully that will work for you. From Purnell, with the social media, social networking being a new item in contact centers, do you think new KPIs will be introduced to measure that environment? I haven't seen any yet, Purnell, and I think social media is much ado about nothing. You're still supporting customers. You're just supporting them through a slightly different device than you were in the past. You might be supporting them through a smartphone. You might be supporting them through an iPad or some other tablet. But the same things that mattered when they were sitting at a computer matter to them when they're holding their smartphone or their tablet. They care about first contact resolution rate. They care about the quality of the solution. The things that matter to them in this, brave new world of social media and social networking are the same things that matter to them in that arcane world of desktop and laptop computers. So I don't see any huge difference in the key performance indicators in this social media, social networking world. Okay, from Kamaljeet. Hi, Jeff. What are the various ways to encourage and promote self-service by end users? Certain things end users can be encouraged to use. For example, an automated password reset tool. There are certain low-end transactions that a customer can perform, but you never want to force a customer down that self-service channel. That's the quickest way to alienate them. That's the quickest way to drive your customer satisfaction down. So what you can do is encourage trials, and you can ensure that they have a good experience when they try going to your self-service website or going to the mobile application, which says that they'll give them self-service, or when they go to a password reset tool, whatever it might be. You want to make that alternative, that channel, obvious to them without forcing them down that channel. The last thing you want to do is hide, press here for voice or click here for voice, click to chat or click to talk. If you hide that from the user, nothing angers them more quickly than hiding that direct path to a live agent, whether it's a chat agent or a voice agent. So what you want to do is make the self-service channel readily available and obvious with a big, click here for, FAQs or click here for web service. And let those that want to use that channel and encourage them. There are various incentives that are used in the industry to encourage people to use those lower cost channels, but above all, you can't make the user feel like they were forced to use that channel, or that will backfire on you and it will hurt your customer satisfaction. Okay, that was the last question that we had. So once again, I just want to thank everybody for joining our session today. Again, I hope you found it to be informative and insightful. Please remember, when you exit the GoToMeeting webcast or GoToWebinar, a survey is going to pop up. And we just ask you to answer that. It gives us a little bit of feedback on how we're doing so that we can improve ourselves next time around as much as possible. And it is a prerequisite. It's a requirement if you'd like to receive a copy of today's presentation. So once again, thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye now.